Amongst the chaos of the 2025 NBA trade deadline, you might have forgotten about the Atlanta Hawks, but a situation is brewing in Atlanta around Trae Young that might quickly become the story of the upcoming NBA offseason. The Hawks this season have been fine, at times even fun. They have good young pieces like Jalen Johnson. Zachary Richeche has been fine for a first overall pick in a weak draft class. Onyeka Okongwu has had some really good moments, but ever since a surprise run to the Eastern Conference Finals a couple of years ago, they have just been an average team. A team that's constantly changing the roster, a team that is always moving pieces around, and that theme continued at this year's trade deadline. DeAndre Hunter and Bogdan Bogdanovic were sent out, and in exchange they got Karis LeVert on an expiring Terrence Mann, who I actually like, some pick swaps, but not a whole lot. And on the surface, that makes sense for where the Hawks are at. They're not really going anywhere. They need to reset the roster. They need to get some picks, build around Jalen Johnson, Trae Young, potentially Richeche, try to tank, get some assets. All that makes sense. But the problem is, the Hawks do not have access to their 2025 first-round pick unprotected. That pick is owed to the San Antonio Spurs as part of the previous DeJounte Murray trade. Now, for the Hawks, I understand the sunk cost aspect of not really caring about a pick that is already out the window. You can't do anything about the 2025 first anyway. You should just still try and build your team the way that you think you should, regardless of whether you do or don't have your first round pick. But the vibes impact of just giving away a top 10 pick can't be ignored. What also can't be ignored is that the actions of the Atlanta Hawks, the decisions that they made around the trade deadline to actively make the team worse, is having a significant impact on the future of Trae Young in Atlanta. Really quickly though, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, PrizePicks. And with the last football game of the year coming up, you know the PrizePicks is going to have some stuff for it. First, we have the Pat Mahomes free square. That's a free square for your selection. If he passes for a single passing yard, that will go as a free square on your selection. Make sure to use that on PrizePicks. And the nice thing is, even though you got football coming up this weekend, you can combine that with NBA stuff throughout the week as well. So if you've never done PrizePicks before, you go through, you look at all these numbers, they have all these numbers set for each of these different games. And if you feel like you have a decent idea about what might happen in a given game, you go through, you pick more or less for each of these, you throw in your Patrick Mahomes free score, maybe you do a couple of other things for football towards the end of the week, and if you're correct, you win some cash. There's all kinds of different ways and promos to play on PrizePicks right now. You got Flex Friday, you got Taco Tuesday, and I would also encourage you to use code SPORTING and click the link in the description to get an instant $50 when you play your first $5 lineup. So if you're new, if you've never done PrizePicks before, this weekend is an awesome time to get started with the end of football season. You can use that promo code. You can use the free square as well from Patrick Mahomes. And thank you again to PrizePicks for sponsoring this video. Now, when it comes to Trae Young with the Hawks, we've known for a couple of years that he hasn't necessarily been enthusiastic about the direction of the franchise. He got a taste of a deep playoff run going to the Eastern Conference Finals a couple of years ago, and right around that time period, there were already rumors about him wanting the team to be better, to improve, to have a better chance of possibly competing for a title, and they have continued to go out and make moves around that time period of adding guys. Remember, they added, Danilo Gallinari, Bogdanovic, who they just traded out. They were aggressive in adding multiple pieces, and now they're kind of back where they were before they made the conference finals, where the team isn't all that good, the future is in question, and Trae Young wants to compete. There are plenty of reports out there that say that if they can't figure it out, if Atlanta can't put a team around him that is going to potentially compete for titles in his mind, he could want to go elsewhere. There are teams around the league that have had discussions with Atlanta in the past about trading for Trae Young. That has been an option for other teams. Atlanta has maybe quietly shopped Trae Young, but not gone out of their way to really try and make an effort to move him. San Antonio has been a team in the past that has been mentioned. Obviously, now they have De'Aaron Fox, but prior to that move, that was something that interested at least a little bit the Spurs. And there's even been some indication in the past that the Hawks were okay moving on from Trae Young, that they weren't overly committed to him being the center of their franchise moving forward. And all of this has been triggered by a not fantastic lead up to the deadline for Atlanta. Ever since Jalen Johnson went out for the season, it's become clear that if it's just Trae Young and some semi-competent pieces, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. So you could argue that we're going into an offseason in which both Atlanta realizes that this is not a great long-term projection for their future with Trae Young at the center of their franchise, and also Trae Young realizes that this is not a winning situation, which could ultimately lead to a Trae Young trade request. Which brings us to, what exactly would the market be like for someone like Trae Young? Because on the surface, he's an incredible offensive player, someone that can be the focal point of a very, very good NBA offense, but also The contract is really big. He's not the biggest guy in the world. He's not a very good defender at all. And if you're looking around the league at what teams need, a small point guard that doesn't really guard isn't really at the top of the list in terms of value around the league. So Atlanta can certainly expect to get something for Trae Young, but maybe not a massive haul of future assets that they would be expecting. But none of that matters to Atlanta if it gets to the point where Trae Young just says he is out. He doesn't want to be there and he would like to go somewhere else. In that scenario, there's a couple of teams to keep an eye on from a basketball fit perspective. I'm not saying they'd be interested in Trae Young. I have no idea what teams would or wouldn't be interested, but just from a basketball fit, there's a couple of teams. The first team that would come to mind would be the Brooklyn Nets. Depending on what happens for them in the upcoming draft, they have plenty of cap space available to absorb Trae Young's contract, which would be nice for Atlanta to be able to get out of a lot of the Trae Young money and then potentially get some future assets as well. The Nets have been trying to find stars to pair with some of their young players they have on the roster and potentially have a roster that makes sense for stars to join, whether it be this offseason or the following, when they have a bunch of cap space, and adding Trae Young could potentially be the first step to that. They obviously need a perimeter creator on the roster. They've got some decent pieces like Nick Claxton, Cam Johnson, and again, some potential future assets as well, and they could view Trae Young as step one of the star attraction plan that they have over the next couple of years as they rebuild their team. As a Nets fan, that would be terrible. I don't want that. Please, I would rather have a bunch of other stars over someone like Trae Young. I certainly don't want to give up significant assets to get him, but that is a name and a team that you're going to see connected if this really does go this way for Trae Young. Another team to keep an eye on would be the Houston Rockets. There's a trade package here that potentially makes sense where it's like Jalen Green and some stuff in exchange for Trae Young, and Houston gets their perimeter creator that they have desperately needed, and importantly, they have a defensive infrastructure that can insulate Trae Young from a lot of his defensive deficiencies, where they can still be a good defensive team even with Trae Young out there. He can be that primary creator, that end of game guy that they need, and that is a structure that would make a lot of sense to a lot of people. I'm not one of them. If I'm Houston, again, that's not the star that I would like to go out and get. I like the structure of my team. I like the defensive impact that my team can have, and Trae Young disrupts that. But again, from a roster perspective, I could see that as a possibility. Another option would be a team like the Miami Heat, a team that is always trying to go out and get stars, a team that definitely needs a little bit more perimeter creation. Him alongside Tyler Hero would obviously be difficult to figure out defensively, but would supercharge their offense. And again, without Jimmy Butler now, a perimeter creator is something that, apart from Tyler Hero, the Miami Heat would certainly be interested in. Now, beyond that, I'm not confident that the Trae Young trade market would be particularly strong in terms of the assets that Atlanta would get in exchange. It's a conversation and a situation that makes sense for each side, where Trae Young wants to move on and compete and the Hawks want to get assets. But if the value isn't there, if there's no option for Atlanta to truly get something that they want in exchange for Trae Young, if the market isn't actually there, then all of a sudden the situation completely falls apart. This obviously is months away as we head into the offseason, but this trade deadline really signified a potential lack of direction in Atlanta, and a direction that might be clarified if they decide that it's time to move on from Trae Young this offseason.